My own son threw a plate at me, and his wife called me a burden. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I just sent a text message that changed their entire life. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Margaret Hale. I'm 63 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that being a good mother meant giving everything to my son, Brandon. After my husband passed away, it was just the two of us. I worked long hours, picked up extra shifts, and made sure Brandon had every opportunity one never had. I was proud when he married and started a life of his own. When he and his wife, Alyssa, invited me to dinner, I thought it was their way of reconnecting. I had no idea how wrong I was. I arrived at their house early because I wanted to help, like any mother would. The moment Alyssa opened the door, I felt something was off. She didn't smile. She didn't even greet me properly. She just stepped aside and said the kitchen was already crowded, even though it was just her standing there. I brushed it off, telling myself I was imagining things, and offered to help set the table instead. As I moved around the kitchen, I could feel Alyssa watching me. Every small thing I did seemed to annoy her. If I folded the napkins a certain way, she changed them. If I reached for a plate, she sighed loudly. Brandon walked in once, gave me a quick smile, and walked right back out, completely ignoring the tension. I tried to keep the atmosphere light by asking about their week, but Alyssa barely replied, and Brandon's answers were short. When we finally sat down for dinner, I hoped things would get better. I complimented the meal and thanked them for inviting me. But instead of appreciating it, Alyssa's face tightened. She said I didn't need to pretend to like her cooking. I told her I really did like it, but she leaned forward and said I had been judging her all evening. I was shocked. I hadn't said a single negative thing. Brandon put down his fork and nodded, saying I was being passive-aggressive again. I stared at him, confused. Passive-aggressive? For trying to help? For trying to bond? I felt my chest tighten, but I forced myself to stay calm. I asked them what I had done wrong, but the more I asked, the angrier they became. Alyssa suddenly stood up, grabbed her plate, and threw it across the table. Food splashed everywhere. Brandon slammed his hand on the table and said I always made things about myself. I felt frozen, as if the world had stopped. My own son, throwing a plate near me like I was the enemy. I wanted to cry, but I didn't. I sat there quietly, holding myself together. When Alyssa called me a burden, I knew there was no point in staying. I stood up, picked up my purse, and walked to the door while they continued arguing with each other. I didn't defend myself. I didn't say a word. I simply left, knowing that silence was the only strength I had left in that moment. And later, when the tears finally came, I sent a text that would turn their lives upside down. I reached their house a little earlier than the time they had given me because I wanted to be helpful, not intrusive. I thought maybe if I helped Alyssa with the cooking, it would make things smoother between us. I walked in with a small smile, hoping for a warm moment, but the second I stepped into the kitchen, Alyssa's expression tightened. It wasn't anger exactly, more like irritation she didn't bother hiding. She handed me a cutting board and a few vegetables without saying much. I started chopping quietly, keeping my hands steady even though the silence in the room felt heavy. A minute later, Alyssa walked past me, glanced at the pieces I had cut, and rolled her eyes so dramatically it was impossible to ignore. She didn't even try to hide it. She leaned over the counter and muttered something under her breath about old people and their slow methods. I pretended not to hear her because I didn't want the evening to fall apart before it began. I just focused on the vegetables, but she continued watching my hands like I was doing everything wrong. When I added a pinch of seasoning, just a tiny bit, she snatched the container and set it on the opposite side of the counter. She said the dish didn't need random touches. I wasn't even trying to change her recipe. I was only trying to help. Brandon walked in at that moment, but he didn't notice anything. Or maybe he noticed and chose to ignore it. He kissed Alyssa on the cheek and asked if everything was ready. She said she would have been done sooner if she didn't have to redo things, giving me a pointed look. Brandon didn't ask what she meant. He didn't even look at me. He just nodded and walked out again. No attempt to break the tension. No attempt to defend me. Nothing. I kept working, quietly slicing and arranging the vegetables the way she wanted them, even though her instructions changed every couple of minutes. She criticized the thickness of my slices, then complained I was cutting too slowly, then told me not to hover even though she had asked me to help moments earlier. She moved around the kitchen in a rush, bumping into me as if I was in her way on purpose. Every time I stepped aside, she sighed loudly, making sure I heard it. I tried to stay positive, telling myself she was probably stressed or tired. But each comment she threw at me chipped away at that hope. She didn't want my help. She didn't want me there. And Brandon, the one person who should have felt the shift in the air, kept walking in and out without once looking at my face. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to cause trouble. I kept telling myself it was just a rough start to the evening. Maybe dinner would be better. Maybe conversation at the table would calm things down. I held on to that hope because I didn't want to believe my son's home had become a place where I felt unwelcome. But the longer I stayed in that kitchen, the more it became clear that the disrespect wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, and it was growing with every minute that passed. Dinner started quietly, almost too quietly. We all sat down, and for a moment, it felt like maybe things would settle. I complimented the meal because despite everything, I did appreciate the effort. But the second the words left my mouth, Alyssa's eyes narrowed like I had insulted her instead of praised her. She set her fork down a little too hard and asked why I was pretending to like it. I looked at her, surprised. I told her gently that I wasn't pretending at all, that the food tasted fine. But she leaned forward, her voice sharper now, and said I had been judging her cooking all evening. I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained I hadn't criticized a single thing, but she cut me off and raised her voice even more, accusing me of acting superior. I could feel Brandon tense beside her, but instead of calming her down or asking what she meant, he looked straight at me and said I needed to stop being so critical. It was like someone had punched me in the chest. I had been careful with my words all evening, walking on eggshells, trying not to cause even the smallest issue, and yet he believed I was the problem. I told him that wasn't true, that I wasn't judging anyone, but the more I tried to explain, the louder Alyssa got. Her voice echoed in the room, sharp and angry, insisting that I always made her feel small. She twisted every simple action I had taken in the kitchen, turning them into accusations I had never made. Brandon nodded along, backing her up, telling me I needed to let things go and stop controlling everything. I felt my throat tighten, but I kept my hands in my lap and my voice calm. I didn't want an argument. I didn't want a scene. But it didn't matter what I wanted, because Alyssa suddenly stood up and grabbed her plate. Before I could even react, she hurled it across the table. It smashed against the wall behind me, food splattering across my shoulder and the chair. The sound was loud, sharp, and final. I gasped, instinctively pulling back, but she wasn't done. She grabbed another dish and threw it right onto the table, sending sauce and pieces of food flying in every direction. It felt unreal, like I was watching someone else's nightmare instead of living my own. Brandon didn't yell. He didn't stop her. He didn't even reach for her hand. He just stared at me with this cold, tired look, like I was the one who had pushed things too far. My heart dropped. My own son, my only child, was sitting there letting his wife scream at me, throw dishes, and treat me like a stranger who had barged into their home. I couldn't move. I felt frozen in my chair, unable to lift my hands or even wipe the food off my face. Humiliation washed over me, heavy and slow. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, and for a few seconds, I couldn't breathe. I wasn't angry in that moment. I wasn't even shocked. I was simply heartbroken. Everything I had done for him, every sacrifice, every moment spent caring for him, it all felt meaningless as I sat there, covered in food, watching the two people I loved least expect to hurt me tear into me like I was their enemy. I didn't shout. I didn't defend myself. I just sat there, holding myself together by the thinnest thread, realizing that something inside me had finally broken. Alyssa's voice only grew sharper after the plates shattered. She didn't calm down, not even for a second. Instead, she pointed her finger straight at me and started shouting that I was rude, ungrateful, and always trying to play the victim. Each word felt like another strike, but I stayed completely still. I didn't trust my voice enough to speak, and honestly, I knew nothing I said would matter to her. Brandon didn't try to stop her. He didn't tell her to lower her voice or take a breath. He just rubbed his forehead like he was exhausted and looked at me with disappointment, as if I had caused all of this. When he finally spoke, his words cut deeper than hers. He told me I needed to learn boundaries, like I had barged into their home uninvited, like I had started the fight, like I had done something unforgivable. Hearing my son speak to me like that, after everything I had done for him, made my chest feel tight. I wanted to ask him when I had ever been a burden to him. I wanted to remind him of the nights I worked late, the bills I paid, the sacrifices I made, the love I poured into raising him. But I kept those thoughts inside. I knew saying them would only make things worse. These two people had already decided who the villain was. Alyssa continued her rant, calling me dramatic, impossible, and controlling. She said I always caused problems and that she was tired of me pretending to be the nice one. Her voice was sharp and hateful, like she had been waiting for this moment. Brandon nodded along, letting her rewrite the entire evening, acting as if every horrible thing she said was reasonable. I felt something inside me go quiet, completely quiet. Not numb, not confused, just done. There was nothing left to explain. Nothing left to defend. They weren't listening. They didn't even want to understand me. They wanted someone to blame, and I was the easiest target. So I pushed my chair back slowly, trying not to slip on the food that was still dripping down the table. Neither of them stopped yelling. They barely noticed me standing up. I walked to the corner where I had left my purse, picked it up, and headed toward the door. I didn't slam it. I didn't make a scene. I kept my steps steady because I refused to give them more ammunition. As I opened the door, I could still hear Alyssa shouting something about how I always ruined everything. Brandon said I was making it worse by storming out. They didn't notice the way my hand shook as I held the doorknob. They didn't see the tears gathering in my eyes. They didn't care. I stepped outside without giving them a single word. No apology. No excuse. No attempt to fix a situation I didn't break. The cold air hit my face, and for the first time that night, I felt like I could breathe again. I walked to my car slowly, feeling every heartbeat in my chest. I didn't cry until I sat behind the wheel, and even then, I wiped my tears quickly. I wasn't leaving because I was weak. I was leaving because I finally understood that staying and begging for respect would be the real weakness. They thought my silence meant defeat. They had no idea it was the beginning of something they would never see coming. When I finally reached home, I could barely keep my hands steady. The drive felt longer than it actually was because my mind kept replaying every word, every shout, every moment when I sat there covered in food while my son did nothing. As soon as I stepped inside, the silence of my house wrapped around me, and all the strength I had held on to slipped away. I closed the door, leaned against it, and the tears I had been holding back poured out without warning. I slid down to the floor, feeling my whole body shake. It wasn't just sadness. It was the shock of realizing how deeply I had been taken for granted. I cried for the years I had given, the love I thought would be returned, and the respect I believed I had earned. But under all that hurt, something else started to grow, slowly, but definitely. Anger. Not wild, loud anger. A quiet, steady kind that comes from finally seeing the truth. I wiped my face and stood up, feeling the weight in my chest shift. I walked to the living room and sat down, letting the calm of the house settle around me. This was my home, paid for by my hard work. My safe place. And suddenly, I remembered something important. The second property they had been living in for years was also mine. The house they treated like their own? I bought it. I maintained it. They lived there without paying a single dollar in rent. I picked up my phone with hands that were still trembling, but not from fear anymore. From certainty. I opened my messages, clicked on Brandon's name, and typed the words I knew would change everything for them. I will no longer be supporting you financially. Please be out of my house by Friday. I read the message twice to make sure it said exactly what I meant. There was no anger in the words. No insult. Just truth. Boundaries. Something I had never given myself permission to have with him. I hit send. For a moment, I stared at the screen, waiting for that familiar feeling of guilt to creep in. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt something like relief. For the first time in years, I was choosing myself, not the version of me that kept giving, forgiving, or shrinking. The real me. The one who finally understood she deserved respect. Before any reply could come, I pressed the block button. First on Brandon. Then on Alyssa. I didn't want to hear their excuses, their shouting, or their attempts to twist the situation. I didn't owe them one more moment of my emotional energy. When the phone screen went dark, the house felt different, lighter somehow. I sat back and took a deep breath. My hands were still a little shaky, and tears were still drying on my face, but inside, something felt firm. Strong. Clear. They had humiliated me in the home I helped them build their life in. And now, they would learn what life looked like without my support propping them up. I wasn't acting out of revenge. I was acting out of self-respect. And this time I wasn't backing down. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I slept well, but because my mind was still alert from everything that had happened. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, trying to calm the thoughts running through my head. I knew the message I sent would hit them hard, but I didn't expect how quickly the consequences would show up at my door. Around 9 o'clock, I heard loud pounding, sharp, angry, impatient. It wasn't a normal knock. It was someone demanding to be let in. I walked toward the door slowly, already knowing who it was. When I looked through the peephole, I saw Brandon on the porch, red-faced and shouting my name. Behind him, Alyssa stood with her arms crossed, tears streaking down her cheeks. I didn't open the door. I unlocked the screen just enough to speak through it. Brandon immediately started yelling, asking what kind of mother would kick her own son out without warning. He said I was overreacting, acting childish, and letting emotions ruin everything. Alyssa chimed in, crying loudly that they had nowhere to go, that I was putting them on the street, that she didn't deserve this. Her voice cracked on purpose. I could hear the performance in it. She wasn't sad. She was scared because the safety net she had been using for years was suddenly gone. I stayed calm and held the door firmly in place. I told them the decision wasn't sudden. It came after the disrespect, the shouting, and the plates thrown. I reminded them of how they treated me at dinner, how they humiliated me, and how neither of them showed a shred of remorse. The silence after that was brief, but heavy. Brandon tried to brush it off, saying they didn't mean it and that people get heated during arguments. I asked him if he thought throwing dishes at someone was normal. He didn't answer. He just clenched his jaw and told me I was being dramatic. Alyssa spoke up again, her voice shaking, saying they would apologize if I just took the message back and let them stay. She said they needed more time, that moving out in a few days was impossible. Her tears kept falling, but none of it touched me. I had seen her real side just hours ago. I told them I had already changed the locks at the second property and that they needed to start packing. Brandon looked stunned, as if he couldn't believe I had acted without warning. But I had warned them the night before with my silence. I had warned them for years with my patience. They simply never believed I would follow through. He started raising his voice again, saying I was heartless, that no decent mother would do this. I let him finish, and then I told him clearly, a decent mother doesn't let her child treat her like trash. A decent mother teaches boundaries. And I was finally doing that. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Alyssa wiped her face, and Brandon took a step back, as if the reality was finally settling in. They thought they could guilt me, pressure me, or scare me into changing my mind. But not this time. I told them they had until Friday. And then, without another word, I closed the door. They stayed outside arguing with each other for a few minutes, their voices fading as they walked back to their car. When their engine finally started and the street went quiet again, I felt the tension in my shoulders loosen. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one apologizing. I wasn't the one begging for peace. I was simply standing up for myself, and that felt stronger than anything I had done in years. Brandon and Alyssa didn't come back after that morning, at least not to my door. But I knew the reality of the situation would hit them soon. They had spent years living in my second house without paying rent, utilities, repairs, nothing. Their money had always gone toward eating out, weekend trips, new clothes, and whatever hobbies they were chasing that month. They never saved because they never had to. I had made life easy for them, and they had taken that comfort for granted. By Thursday, I heard from a neighbor near the second property that a moving truck was parked outside. They were packing in a rush, arguing so loudly that people walking by pretended not to notice. I didn't go to see them. I didn't want to. But I imagined the frustration on their faces as they realized they weren't just moving houses, they were stepping into a life they had never prepared for. They ended up renting a small, rundown apartment on the other side of town. It was all they could afford on short notice, especially with no savings to fall back on. I didn't need to see it to know what it looked like. The walls probably needed fresh paint, the appliances were old, and the space was tight. Nothing like the clean, comfortable home they had enjoyed for years. Suddenly, their lifestyle changed overnight. No more weekly steakhouse dinners. No more spa days for Alyssa. No more new electronics for Brandon. Everything they used to do without thinking now required planning, budgeting, and sacrifice, things they had avoided their whole marriage. And with the pressure came the blame. Alyssa started pointing fingers first. She told Brandon it was his fault for not handling me better, as if I were some problem he failed to control. She complained about the tiny apartment, the cheap furniture, the noise from neighbors, and how embarrassed she was to be living somewhere so different from what she was used to. Brandon pushed back, saying she was the one who made dinner explode, the one who threw the plates, the one who pushed the argument too far. He said if she had just held her tongue, none of this would have happened. He reminded her that I had supported them for years and that she had been the one to create the final spark that burned everything down. Their arguments became frequent and heated, nothing like the polished, perfect image they used to pretend to have. Without comfort, without money, and without the cushion I had provided, everything between them began to show its cracks. They had built their life on convenience, not strength, and now that the convenience was gone, they didn't know how to function together. From a distance, I watched everything unravel, not with joy or satisfaction, but with clarity. This wasn't revenge. It was the natural result of years of entitlement meeting the real world. They were finally feeling the consequences of choices they had made, words they had thrown, and the respect they had refused to give. Their marriage, once full of confidence and shiny pictures, now shook with every financial struggle, every disagreement, every reminder that they had lost the stability they once took for granted. I didn't wish them pain. I didn't wish them failure. But I did know one thing: sometimes the only way people learn is when life stops protecting them. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one shielding them anymore. Margaret spent the next few weeks focusing on herself in a way she hadn't done for a very long time. Her days no longer revolved around stress, fear, or feeling unwanted in her own family. For the first time in years, she could wake up without worrying about what mood Brandon or Alyssa might be in, or what new demand they would push onto her. The silence in her home felt different now. It wasn't heavy or lonely. It was calm. It was hers. One of the first things she did was visit the second property. For years, she had avoided going there, mostly because every visit reminded her of how much she had given without receiving even basic respect in return. But now, standing inside those empty rooms, she felt something she hadn't expected: freedom. The place looked worn out and badly treated, but instead of feeling sad, she saw potential. She hired workers to repaint the walls, fix the broken cabinets, replace the old flooring, and give the whole place a fresh, bright look. Every improvement made her feel as if she was rebuilding a part of herself, piece by piece. When the renovations were finally done, the house looked warm and welcoming again. Margaret listed it for rent properly this time, at its full market value, not out of guilt or obligation but as a responsible homeowner. Within a week, a polite young family applied. They were respectful, grateful, and careful with their words. Margaret approved them immediately, relieved to hand her property to people who would treat it with the dignity it deserved. When she received her first rent payment, she felt a small but meaningful victory. Outside of her responsibilities, she slowly opened her life again. She reconnected with friends she had drifted away from because dealing with Brandon and Alyssa had taken all her emotional energy. When they welcomed her back with warm smiles, she realized how much she had missed adult conversations that didn't include shouting or blame. She joined a community group that met once a week, where people shared stories, helped each other, and laughed freely. She found herself smiling more than she had in years. Margaret also started gardening again. Her backyard had always been her safe place, but she had neglected it while being overwhelmed with problems. Now she planted new flowers, trimmed old bushes, and watered her small herb patch every morning. Watching things grow under her hands brought her a quiet joy. It reminded her that life could be gentle too. As days turned into weeks, her routine became simple but peaceful. She cooked meals she enjoyed, read books she had bought long ago, and slept without fear of a late-night call filled with demands. She didn't feel guilty for choosing herself anymore. Every step she took made her stronger inside, even if no one else could see it. Margaret didn't celebrate anyone's downfall. She didn't seek revenge. She simply rebuilt her life with steady hands and a calm heart. And in that quiet rising, she found a version of herself she thought she had lost forever. Months passed peacefully for Margaret, and she had almost settled into a life where drama no longer followed her. One afternoon, as she was tending to the flowers in her garden, she heard a soft knock at the door. It wasn't loud or angry like before. It was hesitant. Almost scared. When she opened it, she found Brandon standing there, looking nothing like the confident, demanding man he had once been. His eyes were swollen, his clothes were wrinkled, and his shoulders seemed to carry a weight he could no longer hide. He didn't start with excuses or anger. Instead, he broke down almost immediately. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he told her that Alyssa had left. Their fights had gotten worse, the stress had become too heavy, and eventually, she packed her things and walked out. Brandon admitted that he had tried to blame her at first, but deep inside, he knew the truth. Their downfall didn't start with money or the move to a small rental. It started long ago, when he allowed disrespect, entitlement, and carelessness to ruin the relationships that mattered the most. He told Margaret he regretted every harsh word, every accusation, every time he let Alyssa talk to her like she was nothing. He said he understood now why she had finally stepped away. He admitted he had taken her love for granted, assuming she would always forgive, always help, always sacrifice. His voice cracked when he said he missed her, not for her money, not for comfort, but because she was his mother, and he had pushed her away. For a moment, Margaret felt a mixture of emotions. Pain, relief, sadness, and a small spark of hope all tangled inside her. She invited him to sit, listening quietly as he spoke. She didn't interrupt or remind him of every moment he ignored her tears. She didn't list all the times he failed to defend her. She already carried those memories, and nothing he said could erase them. When he finally asked the question he had been too afraid to say earlier, "Can I come back into your life?" the silence hung heavy between them. His voice was soft, almost like a child asking permission he knew he didn't deserve. Margaret looked at him with steady eyes. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't bitter. But the wound he left had not magically healed. She told him gently that forgiveness was possible. She wasn't a person who held on to hatred. But trust? Trust was something different. It wasn't something that could be fixed with tears or an apology spoken out of loneliness. She explained that trust had to be rebuilt through actions, consistency, and respect. It wasn't something he could just ask for. It had to be earned slowly, with sincerity and patience. She made it clear that she wasn't closing the door on him, but she wasn't rushing to open it wide either. Brandon nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He realized this was not punishment. It was a boundary, a healthy, necessary one. As he left, Margaret watched him go, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and strength. She had waited so long for an apology, but receiving it so late reminded her how far she had come on her own. And for the first time in years, she felt firmly in control of her own heart. By the time the last echoes of Brandon's apology faded, Margaret had reached a point she hadn't known existed a few months earlier. She realized that true power didn't come from shouting, fighting, or forcing someone to acknowledge their mistakes. It came from calm, steady decisions, from protecting yourself, and from living your life on your own terms. She didn't need to react with anger or humiliation to teach a lesson. She had already done that in the quietest, strongest way possible. Her revenge, or what some might call her justice, wasn't about payback or cruelty. She didn't go to their rental, didn't make them feel small, didn't post anything about them or publicly shame them. Instead, she claimed her life back. She set boundaries and enforced them. She reclaimed her financial independence by renting the second property to someone who appreciated it. She nurtured her home, her garden, and her friendships. She allowed herself to feel peace for the first time in years, something that no shouting match or argument could ever have given her. She often thought back to that night when the plates were thrown and words were yelled. She remembered how Brandon and Alyssa had believed their anger could control her, how they assumed silence meant weakness. They had no idea that each act of disrespect had only strengthened her resolve. Every insult, every outburst, every unfair accusation had been a reminder of the boundaries she needed to set. And she had done it without raising her voice, without striking back. The quietness of her actions had carried more weight than any loud retaliation ever could. Margaret would smile sometimes, recalling how shocked they had been when they realized they couldn't manipulate her anymore. She didn't feel joy in their discomfort, only satisfaction in her own self-respect. She had learned that revenge didn't need to be dramatic to be effective. The small, decisive steps she took, cutting off financial support, changing the locks, and protecting her emotional space, had changed everything in their lives without her lifting a hand in anger. As she tended her flowers in the morning, Margaret often reflected on how life had shifted. She didn't need them to admit their faults. She didn't need apologies or tears to validate her actions. She had already reclaimed the most important thing they had tried to take from her, her peace. She realized that her quiet, firm choices had given her freedom, dignity, and control. She would often tell herself, quietly, "I didn't throw dishes back. I didn't scream. I just took back everything they took for granted, and that was enough." It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. It was something stronger. It was respect for herself. And if anyone listening had ever been mistreated, she hoped they would understand, you don't need to react violently to be heard. You don't need to shout to be strong. Sometimes the quietest decisions, the ones that protect your heart, your mind, and your life, change everything. Margaret had discovered that truth, and it had made all the difference.